What if I told you Japan's kamikaze, feared as unstoppable human missiles, were suddenly shredded in midair as if hitting an invisible wall? In 1945, young pilots sealed themselves into their cockpits, convinced their sacrifice would sink America's fleet and save their homeland. But a weapon smaller than a man's fist, a secret hidden inside a storm of steel, turned their certainty into horror. This is the forgotten story of the fuse that destroyed not just planes, but the very idea that spirit could triumph over technology. On April 6, 1945, dawn broke over the East China Sea. On the decks of American radar picket destroyers, sailors squinted into the haze, already knowing what was coming. Then, on the radar screens, the contacts appeared. Not a handful, not dozens, but hundreds. A swarm of blips, each one a pilot sealed inside his cockpit, carrying no thought of return. Kamikaze, the divine wind. As the first aircraft descended, American guns opened fire, and the sky erupted. Kamikaze planes disintegrated in mid-dive, exploding far from their targets, shredded by shells that detonated with an uncanny, impossible accuracy, as if guided by unseen hands. At the heart of it all was a secret no one beyond the Allies truly understood. A fuse, a piece of glass and copper that could decide whether thousands lived or died. But to understand why the kamikaze, once feared as unstoppable, would be broken by technology, we must turn back to where this story truly began. To understand the clash that unfolded above Okinawa, we must look further back, into the desperate logic that gave birth to the kamikaze, and the quiet laboratories where America's answer was being forged. By 1944, Japan stood on the edge of ruin. The proud carrier fleets that had thundered across the Pacific at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea were gone, resting at the bottom of the ocean. The decisive battle doctrine, kamikaze, the belief that one massive clash would deliver final victory, had collapsed under the crushing weight of American industry. The battles of the Philippine Sea and the Marianas had cost Japan its most precious and irreplaceable resource: trained pilots. Thousands were lost in mere days. Factories were starved of aluminum and fuel. Training schools were now graduating boys with barely 100 hours in the cockpit, compared to the 500 once required. The nation faced a stark choice: surrender ground inch by inch, or gamble everything on a weapon that cost little more than a man's life. It was Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi who gave this final desperate gamble its name: Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Special Attack Units. The world would come to know them as the kamikaze, the divine wind. The weapon was born of desperation, sanctified by ancient ritual, and praised by the state as the purest expression of a warrior's sacrifice. The Japanese High Command calculated with a cold, brutal mathematics. A single, obsolete zero, armed with a 250-kilogram bomb, might sink a destroyer. One life for hundreds of enemy lives. One outdated aircraft for millions of dollars in damage. In the face of overwhelming industrial inferiority, it seemed brutally efficient. Yet across the ocean, in quiet, brightly lit laboratories, another kind of mathematics was being worked out. In 1940, at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, a small group of American physicists gathered under the codename Section T. Their goal was not mystical or poetic, it was brutally practical: to solve the ancient problem of anti-aircraft fire. Until then, a gunner had to guess a target's distance and speed, twist a timer key on a shell, and pray that it would burst at the right moment in a vast, three-dimensional sky. Even the most skilled crews scored hits only by volume, firing thousands of rounds for a single kill. Against fast diving planes, the odds collapsed completely. Section T sought to change that. Their idea was radical: a shell that carried its own brain, a tiny radio transmitter that sent out a signal, and a receiver that listened for the echo. When an aircraft passed close, the returning signal would shift, the Doppler effect, and the fuse would detonate instantly. No guessing, no timers, the shell itself would know when to explode. Thus, two opposing doctrines emerged on opposite sides of the Pacific, both born from the pressures of a total war. Japan placed its faith in the spirit of human sacrifice, convinced that men who welcomed death could overcome any material disadvantage. America placed its faith in science, convinced that circuits, glass, and copper could save the lives of its own men. The stage was being set for Okinawa, for a final, terrible confrontation. This was the path that led to that fateful clash of philosophies over the Pacific. If you want to continue with us into the depths of these forgotten memories, light the way on our journey with a like, and join our archive by subscribing to ensure they are never lost. The proximity fuse was not simply invented. It was forged through years of trial, failure, and an industrial effort so vast it stretched across the entire United States. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Dr. Merle Tuve's team began with an elegant theory: a radio transmitter and receiver, a Doppler shift that would reveal an object's proximity. On paper, it looked brilliant. In practice, it looked impossible. Imagine a glass vacuum tube, one of the most fragile and delicate pieces of electronics of its day. Now, imagine firing it from a 5-inch naval gun. The shell leaves the barrel spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, slammed forward by forces 20,000 times greater than the pull of gravity. In the early tests, almost everything shattered. The delicate glass tubes cracked. The internal filaments snapped. For months, the laboratory floor was littered with the broken components of failed ideas. But American industry, when mobilized for war, did not give up. Factories that had once made light bulbs and radio sets for living rooms turned their full attention to this impossible problem. Engineers at Sylvania and Raytheon redesigned the glass tubes, experimenting with new formulas and structural supports that could withstand the incredible shock. The Crosley Corporation, once known for its affordable cars and refrigerators, built massive assembly lines that ran day and night. RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, the titans of American consumer industry, now turned their skills to war. By 1943, the device was ready. It was a fuse the size of a man's fist. Inside, 130 components were packed tighter than anything that had ever been mass-produced before. It contained a battery that was activated only by the violent spin of the shell as it left the gun barrel, and a circuit tuned to a specific radio frequency. When an aircraft passed close, the returning signal shifted, the fuse armed, and the shell detonated in a cloud of shrapnel. For the sailors who first witnessed it, it was like magic. No more twisting timers, no more desperate guesswork. A near miss was no longer a wasted shell. A near miss became a kill. Production accelerated at a staggering rate. By 1945, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses per day. Each one now cost only $18, a fraction of the $700 they had cost just 3 years earlier. In total, more than 22 million were made. It was an orchestra of industrial might, a symphony of mass production that no other nation on Earth could match. Imagine you are one of the lead scientists at Section T. After months of failure, you are told that the miniature vacuum tubes are still shattering. The British have already declared the project impossible. Do you recommend abandoning this science fiction weapon to focus on more conventional ordnance? Or do you push American industry even harder, betting the lives of thousands of sailors on the belief that this impossible problem can be solved? Share your decision in the comments below. Across the Pacific, Japan could only dream of such resources. Their own scientists understood the concept. German reports had even mentioned rumors of special Allied shells. But Japan lacked the factories, the materials, and the precision machinery. Their own vacuum tubes were bulky and unreliable. Relentless American bombing raids were leveling what little industry remained. For the Empire, the idea of mass-producing a weapon as complex as the proximity fuse was a complete fantasy. So, while America built electronics by the millions, Japan built men. Kamikaze pilots, young students pulled from universities, farmers' sons barely out of their adolescence. Many had less than 100 hours of flight training. They were taught the basics of navigation, target recognition, and above all, the final terrifying dive. The art of aiming their own aircraft like a spear. Before their final flight, they wrote farewell letters, their young hands carefully brushing the characters onto the page. They drank sake in solemn ceremonial toasts. They tied white hachimaki headbands, marked with the red sun, across their foreheads. Each ritual was designed to transform fear into a cold resolve, to make their own deaths feel sacred. Thus, two great and terrible machines of war were prepared for battle. One was mechanical, humming with conveyor belts, stamping presses, and millions of tiny electronic brains hidden inside steel shells. The other was human, beating with youthful hearts, wrapped in ancient tradition, and driven by the desperate belief that spirit could triumph over matter. The tension and historical weight of this moment, where two vastly different cultures prepared to unleash their ultimate weapons, are immense. If this story is impacting you, support our mission to unearth more forgotten histories by liking the video and subscribing to our archive. Spring, 1945. The Pacific boiled with preparations for the last and bloodiest campaign of the war. Okinawa. For the United States Navy, it was a march into the mouth of the dragon. Hundreds of ships of Task Force 58 assembled, their mission to shield the transports that would bring 180,000 soldiers to the island. But everyone knew what awaited them. To guard against the coming storm, the fleet spread outward. Radar picket destroyers were placed like lonely, sacrificial sentinels, 15 to 20 miles from the main formation. Their crews understood the assignment. They would be the first to see the enemy, and the first to bleed. In Japan, the journey to that same battle was far more personal. Young pilots gathered at dusty airfields on Kyushu. Before dawn, they lined up for their final ceremonies. Officers poured sake into white cups and spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the emperor. Then, silence. Each pilot bowed, their letters to home tucked into their flight suits. Photographs of mothers and sweethearts hidden close to their hearts. When their engines roared to life, farmers and villagers lined the fields, waving flags as the planes rose into the gray morning sky. On April 6, 1945, the storm broke. The first wave of Operation Kikusui swept across the sea, nearly 300 kamikaze aircraft roaring toward Okinawa. On the American radar picket line, the alarm rang out. Air raid, bearing north, multiple bogies, closing fast. Aboard the destroyer USS Laffey, sailors rushed to their battle stations. 5-inch guns elevated, their loaders heaving shells stamped with two simple letters. VT. At 12,000 yards, the first salvos left the barrels. Then the sky erupted. Unlike the scattered, random bursts of older-timed shells, these detonations were chillingly precise. Black puffs of shrapnel blossomed directly inside the approaching Japanese formation. A Zero burst apart in midair. Another spiraled down, trailing a thick plume of fire. But behind the wreckage came dozens more. The kamikaze pilots pressed on, their faces rigid, their eyes fixed on the steel targets gleaming below. The gunners on the American ships swung their weapons frantically, firing again and again. The VT shells detonated as if guided by invisible hands, shredding aircraft that would once have slipped through. But no defense was perfect. The Laffey came under an almost unimaginable assault. 22 separate aircraft attacked her within 80 minutes. In that time, her crews fired more than 345 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition. 9 attackers were destroyed outright by her guns before they could strike. Still, the destroyer was hit by 6 kamikaze and 4 bombs. The ship burned, men died at their posts, yet the Laffey did not sink. She lived because dozens of other planes had been destroyed before they could ever reach her. For the Japanese pilots, the experience was terrifying beyond imagination. They had been told that high speed and low altitude would carry them through the American defenses. Instead, they found themselves flying into walls of fire that seemed to know exactly where they were. Shells exploded 50 feet from their wings, fragments slicing through their canopies, ripping through their flesh. Survivors who aborted their missions later described it as flying through a solid curtain of explosions. The statistics were undeniable. Before the arrival of the VT fuse, American ships needed on average more than 1,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition to shoot down a single attacker. At Okinawa, that number dropped to just over 300, a four-fold leap in effectiveness. The human contrast was stark. For every kamikaze who died in a blaze of fire and water, there were American sailors who lived because of a circuit no larger than a thumb. $1 billion of wartime investment had paid for something priceless: survival. By June 1945, Japanese intelligence reports conceded that the kamikaze tactics had lost their power. The cost in lives was unsustainable, even by the brutal logic of suicide warfare. The immediate consequence was clear. Okinawa remained in American hands. The invasion force endured, and every surviving sailor, every ship that limped away from the flames, owed part of that survival to a tiny fuse hidden in the nose of a shell. The battle's outcome was not just measured in wreckage, but in the shattering of a belief. For the Japanese command, the proximity fuse broke their faith that spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage. For the Americans, it confirmed that science and industry could forge a shield to preserve lives even in the most desperate storm. If you believe the sacrifices made and the lessons learned from this brutal chapter of history should never be forgotten, honor this memory with a like and subscribe for our future archives. This story is a powerful reminder that history is not just about courage and sacrifice, but also about the silent, invisible innovations that can decide the fate of thousands. If you agree, share this memory with a friend who needs to understand this side of history.